Hello and welcome to our first event at the PEG Education Group. PEG is the Partition Education Group, I beg your pardon. This event will be shared as part of the South Asian Heritage Month, and it is actually being produced by PEG itself. So my name is Raj Unsworth and I'm chair of the group. The group's been around for a few years now, and the original aim of the group was to ensure that the Partition of India was commemorated. And then the next aim really was to think about inclusion of the teaching of partition within the UK curriculum. And actually, I think we have come to realize that we can't really just teach partition on its own. There's an awful lot behind it, the context, South Asian history, and actually British colonial history, and how that could be and should be incorporated into the UK education system. And today we have got three panel members who have been with us on this journey from the outset. They're three academics, experts in their own field, and they have supported both South Asian Heritage Month in all its aims, and also the work that we are undertaking ourselves. Now, rather than me introduce each of them, I'm sure they can tell you a little bit about them themselves. And then also, as part of that, if they could tell us why this is so important to them personally, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much, Raj. Yes, so my name is Sarah Ansari. I'm a professor of South Asian history at Royal Holloway, University of London. A lot of my more recent research, at least, has focused on the period around and after 1947. So in a sense, partition has been there directly, indirectly, affecting a lot of what I've worked on. I work actually on places that are today part of Pakistan, but obviously in 1947, when partition took place, were part of British India. Why partition is important to me personally, I suppose, is that, you know, I have a family connection to South Asia, and family connection to people who were uprooted and had to move thanks to the impact of partition on their lives. In their case, they moved from India to Pakistan. So I have a strong personal interest in the history of this period. And I'm also very, very strongly supportive of the idea that South Asian history is intrinsic to part and parcel of British history, and that there shouldn't be some artificial divide between the two sets of histories that these involve. So thanks, Raj. I hope that helps explain where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Deborah.
Hi, thank you, Raj. I'm Deborah Sutton. I teach modern South Asian history at the University of Lancaster. So my research interests relating to partition, I suppose, are twofold. I was very interested in what happened to populations of Indian origin in remnant colonial territories outside of South Asia, so principally in Mauritius and in Kenya, and looking at the way in which both the same histories of imperial governance that used religious identity to understand and to govern and to distill sort of forms of representative government, how that sort of played out outside of India. And of course, what happened after 1947 when India became independent and had to work out who these people of Indian origin were outside of India, were some of them now Pakistani, were some of them Indian, and how. I'm also interested in the way in which partition transforms cities, in particular Delhi. So I've looked at the way in which the arrival of around 300,000 displaced people into Delhi transformed the city in a myriad of ways. But I'm interested in the fabric of the city, and particular monuments and mosques as places of accommodation and hospitality within the city. I do teach partition as well to undergraduate students. And one of the great challenges I find is communicating the partition both in terms of its scale, its subcontinental scale, its global scale, and those implications, which are, I think, arguably ongoing, but also giving a sense of social catastrophe. So it's a sort of, it's now become idiomatic that it was the world's or history's largest migration at around 15 million, between 1 and 2 million casualties. But how do you teach that in a way that allows students to begin to understand the lived human experience of that immense social catastrophe? So yeah, that's my existing interest in the partition.
Thank you, Deborah. And Will?
Hi, I'm William Gould, Professor of Indian History at the University of Leeds. My research, to some extent, relates a little bit to what Sarah just talked about. I'm a historian of mid-20th century India, and I've been interested in partition principally as a kind of turning point for trying to explore how citizenship in South Asia developed in the early post-1947 period of South Asia's history. And I've done a range of different research projects and bits of research that explore the history of India around that 1940s, 1950s, 1960s period. Like Deborah, I also have been teaching the Partition of India at university for quite a number of years now. And I suppose my kind of interest in this event and its importance to me personally relates to some of the things that have already been said, the fact that this is the most significant really event of mid-20th century decolonization anywhere, globally one of the most important events if we're trying to understand European decolonization, and so therefore of both British and global significance. But also I think more fundamentally for me, and this relates to the British education system, I feel as though there's an opportunity in exploring South Asian history, events such as this, for trying to effect a kind of a culture change in how we teach history in both, in public education and schools more generally of our colonial past. And I think there needs to be a culture change in how we represent the histories of empire. And in some ways, the history of partition is one really good way into that, because it allows us to explore, as Sarah mentioned, the interconnections between countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Britain. So yeah, that's in brief my interest.
Thank you, Will. I think it's fair to say, one of the things that strikes me is that I came to the UK when I was 7. So I have been educated in the system here. I have 3 children. The youngest is now 21, so they have been through the system. And my own personal involvement in education has been as the trustee governor for about 25 plus years. And I can honestly say that I knew absolutely next to nothing about partition until I met Benita Kane, who was one of the founders of the whole kind of movement of the recognition, the commemoration. And I think that given, we have, I believe that 1 in 20 people in the UK can trace their ancestry back to South Asia. I think it's absolutely appalling that so few people know about it. Now, it's interesting also because I was asking a head teacher friend recently, and I said, well, what do you understand if I ask you, what does partition mean to you? And the automatic response was, this was like a partition war. And then I said, well, okay, so it's not that. What do you understand by the partition? As Will said, as you said, Deborah, one of the most momentous events. The partition, kind of a fairly blankish look. And then finally, I said, what about the Partition of India? What does that actually mean to you? And yes, she's heard of it, but really had no knowledge of it at all. And that kind of brought me on to, if people who are responsible for educating our children know so little, then we've got, and we also know that because of the trauma on families and the historical association, many Asian families do not talk about the events of partition. They're beginning to open up more now, but they don't. So 2nd, 3rd generation South Asian, they also know very little. And I do think that because it is shared history, it's not Indian history, it's not Pakistani history or Bengali history, it is actually our shared history. And therefore, that's why we're running this event, and that's why the title really is Learning About Partition and Introduction. So with that in mind, for the benefit of people who may watch this who know absolutely nothing about it, could each of you please share a few sentences in a nutshell, what was the partition of India? And then we will move on later on to context and things. So who wants to go first? Sarah again, maybe in that order? Oh no, sorry, Deborah, you put your hand up.
Well, only because I thought maybe it's easier to go first and then the others can pick up the immense amount of slack that I leave.
Thank you.
I suppose partition from an imperial point of view and an imperialist racist point of view was a solution to an intractable ethnic problem. That there was a political life of religious identity, that political aspirations could be mapped onto and solved through a manipulation of territory. So the creation of a sovereign boundary in order to separate and pacify. So that is the imperialist construction. And of course, we know it from other areas. We know it from Palestine, we know it from Ireland, this notion that you could solve ethnic problems. And again, I'm sure the others will say something about the nature of that ethnic problem and its construction as a result of the imperial intervention through creating territory, through the logic, this compelling logic of the nation state, of the ethnic nation state, which again is an opportunity to use, as Will said, the partition to think about a whole bunch of other questions, huge questions in modern history. So I'll stop there and hand over.
Okay, Sarah.
Yes, I mean, I think, Deborah, you set us up beautifully there. So I'm just thinking which thread to take hold of. I suppose if I was trying to explain in the sense what the partition of India was, for somebody who knew absolutely nothing, I'd be saying it was the mechanism or the process by which at independence, India didn't end up one united sovereign state, one country, but was subdivided into, at that point, two separate sovereign states. So India and this new creation, Pakistan. And Pakistan in due course, because it was a very strangely shaped territorially, at least country, with an east and a western half divided by, over 1,000 miles, let's say, of Indian territory. East Pakistan later on became Bangladesh in 1971. So I would say, well, what is partition? Partition was the process by which the map of South Asia that we see today came to be. And as Deborah was saying, it was a solution hit on by the British, but agreed to in due course by relevant, I suppose, Indian parties, to how to bring an end to the British presence in India in as quick a way as possible in the aftermath of the Second World War. So if I stop at that point and hand over to Will, he may want to take the baton from me.
I don't know whether I can add much more as just a basic introduction to those things that Deborah and Sarah just said, except that to add perhaps that it was a solution defined by a colonial state that was deciding to decolonize, to hand over power to two new independent nations, and that, to add to what's already been said, that it wasn't really anticipated actually by most ordinary people on the ground, that this was a solution that really was made, or decisions that were made largely at the top levels of government, and in which there was a huge amount of human tragedy, a movement, mass migration of people. And as a result of that division into separate nation states and as an effect that had on millions of people's lives, that has had a kind of a long-term range of cultural, social, economic effects on people living in that part of the world, but also globally, who became members of those, citizens of those newly independent states. And so partition is more than just, it is exactly those things that Deborah and Sarah just described. It's also something that had a kind of an ongoing living history that goes into how we might understand India, Pakistan and Bangladesh after 1947. But we're going to talk more about that in a moment. You didn't leave me much to say.
No, we are indeed. So in terms of, I'm really curious to understand, having spent hundreds of years in India and actually in other colonized nations as well, what on earth prompted this kind of, in some respect, you could almost think of it as madness, really. How did they decide why did they decide, the context behind it, who decided where that line was going to be. And actually, crucially for me, which is really important, is that were the people consulted in any shape or form? Who's jumping in first?
I'll go in first this time, since I haven't been first yet. Yes, well, I think the important thing to remember about the actual physical boundary that was created at the time of partition is that, first of all, there was no inevitability about the fact that it would actually be a partition until very late in the negotiating process. In fact, you could, although it's been discussed in 1946, you could argue it's not until Mountbatten becomes viceroy, the last viceroy, that partition becomes very, very likely, or is going to happen. And therefore, the very idea of there being clearly separated sovereign states itself comes about in a definite sense quite late in the total period of the negotiations.
So what sort of period of time are we talking about?
So we're talking about, through the Second World War, essentially, the first sort of, I suppose, serious kind of British negotiation in terms of India's political future, as Indian parties were hoping would happen after the Second World War. Perhaps we might date it back to 1940, or let's say 1942, the Cripps mission sent out to discuss the future, India's future as an potential independent state. And so you have that mission in 42, you have another one in 46, but at those stages, there's no definite sense that there's going to be actually a partition, a separate sovereign state known as Pakistan. In fact, there's a solution in 1946 that's quite different, which is the idea of a three-tiered government within which there'd be autonomous regions where Muslims would have some kind of level of autonomy within a confederate, unified India. Second thing I'd say is that the actual boundary is decided without very much consultation, Indian consultation, the actual boundary, essentially by a British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, who is sent out to define the boundary through a boundary commission that he doesn't particularly consult with very seriously or in much detail. And he has to take decisions on the basis of an idea of the demography of the region, without very much knowledge of its topography, without very much historical knowledge of its history, its economy. And that decision is taken very quickly within the space of 4 or 5 weeks, and is essentially kind of superimposed on India at that time. So, and in fact, the results of the Boundary Commission are not revealed until after independence itself. But I won't go on anymore, because I'll let the others come in on that as well.
Okay.
I'd make one small addendum to that very, very lovely summary that Will offered, which is that the Attlee government had originally said independence would be in the middle of 1948, but they moved it forward, increasingly concerned about Indian political responses to the possibility of power being transferred to more than one sovereign state, which was a possibility that had been raised in 1942 by the Cripps mission. And the minute that had been offered, then the question of a single Indian union, albeit with degrees of provincial autonomy, which would undoubtedly have been controlled by the largest political party, the Indian Congress, was increasingly fraught and was increasingly challenged. So Mountbatten decides at the beginning of 1947 to move the date of independence, and of course the British departure, forward to August. And it's about a sleight of hand that's affected, where the British go from being, as it were, rulers to referees, and increasingly take a position of exasperation with the ways in which Indian politicians are trying to think around the kind of landscape of possibility that's been presented to them. And really it's a massive
hundreds of years of effective occupation, and they're getting impatient with the fact that people they have ruled for so many years are maybe a little bit too slow off the mark for them. Is that kind of what you're saying, really?
And I think an increasing concern about violence, violence, and the possibility of this escalating. And rather taking a position of governance, of responsibility, they immediately decide, that sleight of hand to say, now we're leaving. And we are simply here to identify the most appropriate way in which power can be apportioned. And it's that mentality into which the partition as a solution appears. It's a solution for the British to get out as quickly as possible. It's a face-saving device in certain ways.
I mean, I think just to quickly, sorry to, I think you also need to, I suppose, bear in mind in that decision that there were parties within India, Indian parties, who also wanted the British to leave as fast as possible. So you know, the decision to quit faster was in some respects in the interests in that particular juncture of the Congress, and particularly Nehru and Patel in the Congress party, because they could see, I think they foresaw that there might be trouble in having to accommodate themselves to the Muslim League in writing a constitution. If they were having to work through a confederate system with you know, a complex future united Indian government. So to some extent, although it is largely the decision of the British to speed up, it is the decision of the British to speed up that timetable, to some extent that comes about partly as a result of the circumstances of what also the dominant political party in India could see as the best, or let's say the least problematic solution for them. So there is an element of that, I think, within this too. Sorry, Sarah's time.
Shall I come? Okay, I'll come in, and I mean, again, I concur absolutely with what Deborah and Will have just said. I suppose I just want to throw in this idea that, in a way, understanding the history of this period is a bit like peeling an onion, or at least, you know, there are these different layers. You know, we keep having to kind of peel off layers. And I think Will and Deborah have just been talking about the immediate, you know, run up to independence and partition. But if you take that first layer off, let's say, and you see what's the layer below, then I suppose we've been touching on it a little bit, but it's really the Second World War and the impact that the war is having, just broadly speaking, on political life in India, whether it is, as Will's just been suggesting, and Deborah before talked about it, you know, intensifying sort of nationalist protests because of the way in which, apart from anything else, India was taken into the Second World War without consultation. And, you know, that generated obviously huge backlash, really. But in the context of that backlash, that created an opportunity, to sort of simplify things, of the British turning to another kind of set of interests within Indian political life, which was a party called the Muslim League, which by the time of the war was starting to kind of, I suppose, articulate a sort of some kind of future dream plan, maybe of some kind of separate political identity for Indian Muslims. So everything was very vague and it's all very contingent. I mean, these are times when people don't have necessarily set agenda, but are, you know, maneuvering themselves. So that next layer down in terms of kind of dismantling the onion would be to just recognize just how momentously important the Second World War was to the way in which the things unfolded, negotiations, time pressure, Britain's own changed role in the world, the changed position of political parties in India. But obviously there are other layers of the onion that we perhaps need to peel off that will take us further back in time, because you know, as Will was saying, this all came about really quite unexpectedly towards what was in the end of British rule in India. And for decades leading up to that, you know, there were developments that, certainly didn't seem to be suggesting that this was the way that Indian political life, or the subcontinent, let's say, future political trajectory would follow. So, yeah. So that's just a thought, you know, with history, you just have to keep going back, don't you? I mean, it's just the way things are. Yeah.
I think given what we know now, as in terms of the impact on the population, on all peoples, on women, on children in particular as well, given what we know now, I suspect that there wasn't a great deal of consideration given to what the impact would be and how it would actually look on the ground, what actually happened, this mass migration of people finding themselves on the wrong side of the Radcliffe line and thinking, how the hell do I get from where I am to where I want to be, and do I really want to go, and if I stay, what does that mean for me, because I might be in a minority in a different country. So I think I'm really interested in the impact on people, especially on women. And one of the other things I think some of our younger, if we have younger viewers maybe struggling to understand, is that in this digital age that they've grown up in, and we have all the information and we have everything at our fingertip, how on earth did people know what was going on? You know, given we're already saying that the timescale was so short, people must have literally found out very much at the last minute, which would explain why they ended up pretty much sort of dropping everything and going. So how were people communicated with at the time? Do you have any idea in terms of what impact it had on families? Does anybody want to comment on that? It was unmuting.
Well, I've unmuted myself just to state the obvious, really, which is that, yes, I mean, you know, people weren't living in the kind of communication age that we are today. And, you know, as you say, all those sort of digital things that we have at our fingertips. But we mustn't downplay the, you know, the speed with which rumor and could spread. Yeah. So there's almost a sort of like a domino effect, I suppose, taking place. I mean, if we want to just go back a little bit further, we see one of the the earliest major outbreaks of violence taking place actually in Calcutta in August 1946. Now, without going into details as to why that was the case, it just, I mean, we look at the response to that, and what we see really is that in response to that violence in August 46, there was almost a trail, let's say, of violence that spread across from Bengal, across northern India, Bihar, UP, and then finally to the Punjab and beyond. And how did that spread? It spread through word of mouth, through reports in newspapers. And so, you know, the problem is, though, when you hear rumor, yeah, and you perhaps nearer to August 1947 have people, you know, moving through your territory on the way to what they think is a place of greater safety, who bring the tales of what happened to them or around them with them, it becomes, I suppose it's a bit like fuses being lit all over the place that then, you know, ignite further violence, you know, in retaliation, in revenge. And so I think understanding the way in which information could reach people and the confusion of that time helps us to maybe understand what people were living through, the uncertainty that they were living through in those months.
Yeah, I'd add something very briefly, which is our sense is that families and communities moved with great uncertainty and very often gradually, responding both to kind of the rumours that Sarah identifies, but also soon after partition has been agreed, anyone who worked for the government of India in those regions would receive would be asked, you know, if they were Muslim, do you want to move to Pakistan? Now, this would be a very strange notion to many of them, but they would begin thinking, well, should I go first? Should my family go? Should my sister go? What should I, you know, so this was a process that was embedded in all sorts of ways in specific families and specific professions, in extended families, in ways that it's fascinating to begin to recover. But it's interesting, I think, also to think about why we know so little. It's because partly it was bizarrely, I think, unexpected. There was a notion that if Radcliffe got the line right, using census data, using survey, very often out-of-date materials, everything would be fine, as long as he identified these areas of contiguous Muslim majorities, then that would be, they didn't expect anyone to move, which is why they were so unprepared for massive displacement. And the actions and the feelings and the experiences of displaced people were very often accounted for in ways that sort of shut it down, so that the historian Gyan Pandey is very compelling about the way in which words like sort of chaos and brutality and insanity were used. So everyone could see this happening. They could see this violence taking place, but it was accounted for in a way that made it look like there is no history here. You know, there is no texture, there's nothing of significance. It's just brutality, it's just insanity. So this extraordinarily rich, diverse experience of ordinary men and women ended up being sort of shut down, and it took historians really decades. I mean, I'm sure Will and Sarah can say more about this, decades to think about there being a history of that experience.
Yeah. When you hear the story that some families are beginning to share, it really was quite horrific. Families lost pretty much all their members, and some children are left orphaned, and what they did and how they tried to migrate across. Will, do you have anything further?
I was just going to quickly add a couple of things, going to Deborah's last point. It wasn't really until the mid-1990s, 96, 97, that the kind of oral history of people's ordinary experiences really started to come out fully in the historical research. And I think that's partly the result of the sort of trauma. People talk about the trauma of partition, the fact that people haven't been, going back to your point, Raj, haven't been comfortable to talk about this until there is enough, as it were, distance between the events. Just to add a couple of other things. I mean, there's a very Blackadder-esque civil servant called Malcolm Darling, who was posted in Punjab, and he did a tour of Punjab in 1946. And in his diaries, he talks about how in late 46, early 47, there's a discussion of the possibility of Pakistan. So there is some rumor mill going on as early as that. But I think the point that just to reiterate is that not only did we know, even when partition itself happened, people didn't necessarily realize that it was permanent. People didn't necessarily imagine that they were never going to go back to their original homes. And so what you have is what a lot of historians have called a long partition, a process in which people take a long time to come to terms with the dislocation from their original homes. And you have lots of people who are lost, kind of caught between jurisdictions, or don't have a very clear identity, or are not sure where their family belongs, are not sure whether they're a citizen of one place or the other. And in fact, the very regime of who is a citizen of which country is worked out as a result of these people's movement, essentially, and their decisions to move. And so you have people that are caught on the wrong side of the border, you have people with properties in the wrong place, you have all sorts of things happening that dislocate people's lives. So I think, just to reiterate this idea of their, as well as not anticipating partition, not anticipating the permanency of partition is also another aspect of the people's history. And going back to the thing about women, we'll perhaps come on to it later. This is also very gendered, you could say. Experiences are very kind of variable around, I think, the experiences of women compared to men, around how families experience it differently within the family. And we could talk a bit more about that, but I think that might come up later in the discussion. So yeah, that's another really interesting aspect of this.
Yeah, I suspect this may be the first of discussion. This is really kind of an introduction, as I said before. So moving on, though, thinking about Britain today with our, wonderful sort of diverse society, what do you think were the consequences and outcomes of partition in terms of where we are today, as we are today as a society? Any volunteers to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, I think not so much where we are today as a society, but I think we need to recognize that, the upheaval that partition represented and its knock-on effects really, had a part to play in later migration from the subcontinent South Asia to Britain. I mean, okay, you can't simply just put it down to that, but in, people, once they've had to move once, are perhaps going to be more ready to move again. And if we think that, the vast majority of people who came to Britain, at least, for a long time, came from places directly impacted by partition, so Punjab and Bengal, and in due course, I suppose, parts of Kashmir. The sort of the makeup, let's say, of Britain's own South Asian communities, can be directly connected to the events of 1947, I would say. So that's one thing just to point out. But obviously people come, and they come carrying, I suppose, legacies of that very difficult period with them. And I mean, it's well known, I think, that when South Asian migrants first came to Britain, their religious differences perhaps weren't so weren't as emphasized perhaps as they've later come to be, but I do think that South Asian communities in Britain today carry the scars, let's just say, of partition, whether in a way they're visible or not. And I think community relations in this country still are impacted by maybe the suspicions that partition, generated really between communities in South Asia. They're they've become part of Britain's landscape in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, you do hear families who, finding themselves on the wrong side in either in Pakistan or in India, felt they didn't belong there despite their religion, and therefore when the opportunity arose and we in Britain were wanting people to come and work here, they took up those opportunities. So I think that sort of post-partition, there would have been some movement to other parts of the world pre-partition anyway, because as you say, the rumors were already flying around. And there was no way of confirming whether they were true or not and when it was likely to happen. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thank you, Sarah. Deborah, would you like to?
I must say, this is something that I know far less about, my inadequate understanding of British history, which is a shameful thing. So I might pass on to Will if he's got anything to add.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think Sarah's summarized it really well. I mean, I think, partition, the division of the subcontinent into separate nation states had a kind of a global effect, clearly. And I think it, it shaped or colored or kind of textured the nature of, as you put it, Raj, the kind of the most significant in terms of numbers of migrants from what became Commonwealth, South Asia, India, Pakistan as a part of the Commonwealth into Britain in the post 47, 50s, particularly 60s and 70s period. Okay. And I think it clearly shaped the geostrategy of South Asia that then had a knock-on effect on how British governments negotiated with either the Indian or the Pakistani governments about the visa regimes that were then eventually put in place to gradually restrict the movement of people from these new nation states into Britain. So it absolutely shapes people's, as it were, identities as South Asians in the United Kingdom and their sense of being a post-colonial people in Britain. That the idea of being, having identities that split between more than one, as it were, jurisdictional place, I think has been very much formed and shaped by the nature of, the kind of artificial religious differences that partition created. And so we talk about, it's interesting that this project that we're a part of, we framed it as South Asian Heritage Month or South Asian, a kind of South Asian project. But if we go back in time, people might have talked more about British Muslims, or they might have talked about the separateness of Indian and Pakistani communities. So I think there's a very interesting and complex politics of South Asians or British Asians or Brasians, the different terms that have been used, in which the partition of India has shaped the tensions within it, as Sarah just mentioned. But I think, like you just said at the beginning, Raj, there's a kind of a curious sort of to some extent there's also there's kind of a lack of full understanding of that history to some extent within Britain. Not just maybe amongst South Asian communities, but also more importantly, or as importantly, let's say, amongst white British communities. And it's also part of their history. And so you could say that, partition is something that white British communities also need to fully come to terms with, to understand, that, as it were, Britain's, colonial past, what Britain became after that, the extent to which we welcomed Commonwealth migrants or not, what is the history of racism in this country? It's absolutely shaped by that particular migration from South Asia, I think, in particular kinds of ways. So in order to understand British society, you need to also understand that really momentous mid-20th century post-colonial migration from South Asia in this country.
Yeah. I think that kind of brings us on to my next kind of question. We're kind of moving on to education itself. And I think, Will, I think actually you've all kind of hit the nail on the head there. And I think one of the issues we have is that we currently appear to have quite a broken society. And I think some of that stems from a genuine lack of understanding. If we think about, And I'm not talking just partition now. Obviously, we are the Partition Education Group, but there are other major events in the world that also we should be aware of. And they're not the events of just those countries. They are all shared. You know, they're shared, whether they're in the West Indies, whether they're in Africa, Ireland. We talked about Ireland. And I think it's really important. So that we do teach these. And so we have to do this with children in schools, which is what we're focusing on. And I think through South Asian Heritage Month, it's that education of communities too, through whether we're talking about culture, music, food, you know, all of that. It's about educating all of us to be a better sort of society. I hate that word tolerant because I don't really like being tolerated. I prefer to be respected, you know, but you know what I mean? It's that's important. So in terms of education, why is it important to you that British colonial history is taught in our schools?
I don't mind.
You go ahead, Deborah.
I think it might be useful just to start thinking of imperial history and British history in the modern period as almost being kind of interchangeable. They're the same thing. It's a lot of the kind of accepted aspects of history teaching. So we're very comfortable talking about British history, Indian history, German history, French history. So we take for granted that the nation state can provide a sort of self-evident frame through which to teach history. Whereas really a fairly superficial glance at the modern period shows us that you cannot understand the nation state without understanding imperialism. They're intimately linked. And the partition is just the best possible way. It's just such a profound aperture for thinking about the relationship between imperialism and nation state, because here was a process of decolonization that saw its solution in the creation of two different nation states, that then created three nation states after 1971. And again, there are other examples that we can look at the way in which imperialism and the ethnic nation state, which we simply take for granted, you know, it's a way of questioning it. The imperialism gives us a way of thinking about the nation state. And even thinking about British history, the fact that we have Great Britain, the United Kingdom, how do you account for Northern Ireland? I mean, there is no way of thinking through the very terms that we use to understand the territory in which we sit without reference to imperialism. So I think one of the challenges is to get away from this kind of polemic of seeing imperialism as something which is associated with judgment, with guilt, with shame. It is the only way you can understand modern history. It is the only way you can give students a sort of nuanced understanding of an integrated and analytical history. I think one of the challenges is that, of course, at university, we teach history through the nation state. You'll routinely see courses being framed as British history, German history, you know, Irish history, without being problematized by, you know, looking at what the nation state is. And I think very often teachers themselves feel a little bit unsupported in using the modern imperial period as a framework, as a way of sort of engaging students. So I'll stop there and pass on. I could go on and on, but I won't.
Shall I go next?
Yes.
I think Deborah summed that up beautifully, so well about the nation state. I mean, to add something slightly different to that, I suppose another reason it's really important to teach this in schools today, or in these days, let's say, is that we're kind of, I suppose we're going through times in which the experiences of migrants, people who are displaced globally, has become increasingly important. And as I see it, one of the problems of British political culture is an inability to come to terms with the responsibilities that we have in a very wealthy and comfortable context in which we live, for people whose lives have been displaced and disrupted very often as a result of the policies of our own government or governments that we're allied to. And therefore, I think learning about something like partition hopefully gives young people a sense of what it really means to have to leave your home. You know, what does it really mean to be forced out of your home into an alien place in often violent circumstances? And how do you make a life in a new place? And how do you then carve out a new kind of identity, a new sort of life? And then how does the population properly welcome those people, and hopefully, don't fall into the trap of, not welcoming those people, as it were, to kind of put it bluntly and simply. I think all of those things, the kind of human, as it were, history, the social history of partition, also is extremely important in understanding other forms of mass migration, forced migration, displacement in other contexts, not least the ones that we ourselves, are coming to terms with this country. And it's part and parcel of that larger thing we talked about earlier, which is how we come to terms with our role globally in Britain. So I'll stop there. Let Sarah say something.
Will, thank you.
Yeah, I'd just add, picking up again on Deborah and Will, I suppose looking forward rather than looking back, because of where Britain is today, because of recent political choices that have been made, because of, in a way, you could suggest that Britain's kind of searching for some kind of reconfigured role in the world. There's a temptation to sort of look back at Britain's kind of imperial past, to sort of think that somehow that entitles Britain to all sorts of, entitles it to a certain role moving forward. And I think if we don't, by we, I just mean British people more generally, but if we're not exploring what that imperial past, in inverted commas, was in a sort of open, warts and all kind of way, then how do we actually face the future? I think we know, I think all of us here, just how political history is, how history gets manipulated, politically everywhere, all around the world. And I think we have to teach South Asian history, partition as perhaps that portal, that way in order to, in a way, equip our young people to be able to look at history more broadly and understand, the way it's used, the ends to which it's put. So I think there's a very big kind of broad mission almost involved in not just telling histories that are easy to tell, but telling the difficult ones as well. And what makes partition difficult is that it's not like the Holocaust. It's not that you have, clear-cut perpetrators, victims, messy story. But that's what a lot of history is. Yeah.
I think we are now, as a result of, Black Lives Matter last year, and as a result of everything that's going on globally, I think people are genuinely asking questions. And one of the things that encourages me is that hearing young people say, well, okay, so I've been through the education system, and yes, I was born in this country. My parents weren't, but I was. And actually, I don't see myself reflected in the curriculum. I don't see me, and actually, it's not just my history; it's our shared history. So I've got gaps in my education, and we want those gaps filled. And I think we do young people a disservice by saying that they can't understand or appreciate, or might be upset by what may be considered to be a shameful past in some respects. We can't undo history, but what we shouldn't do is sugarcoat it either. We should be telling children, well, this is, and that's how we learn lessons. Maybe if we were having partition today, they wouldn't get Radcliffe come along and draw this wibbly wobbly line, because that's what he thought should happen. Maybe things would have been done better. Could have been. We know they could have been done better. But I think we really, really do a disservice to young people. And in terms of, I often get, schools are currently looking at using EDI strategies in terms of ensuring that their curriculum is broader. And one of the issues we have is that, of course, our education system is also slightly fragmented, in the sense that we've got maintained schools. Now we're talking about England, really I shouldn't be. If we're talking UK, we know Scotland, Wales, Ireland, they have their own systems. They don't have academies. We do have academies in England, and they have autonomy. They don't have to follow the national curriculum. And therefore we've got this fragmented system. And what we are attempting to do as the Partition Education Group is have representation from each of these so that we can begin to look at producing materials and get teachers to produce materials and think about what age groups. Now, I don't know what your views are on this, and I'd really be interested to hear this. We're not touching the GCSE A levels, and actually there's an argument that says that's probably a little bit too late. We need to start sooner. So what are your views on actually teaching some of the partition elements in primary and then topping up in secondary, possibly year 8, 9? Any of you got any views on that? Will?
Yes, I mean, I think probably that age group from the age of about 9 or 10 up to 13 or 14 is actually an ideal period of time, in the sense that some of the things we've just been talking about, that Deborah introduced, the idea that we shouldn't necessarily just think about history in terms of the countries and the nations, that we need to understand this history in terms of the disaggregation, I wouldn't use that word, but, you know, the breakdown of the idea of, you know, the geographies that we do around the nation. That's a really good time to start doing that, because it's a period in which young people are probably quite imaginative and creative in how they're thinking about their relationship to different spaces and countries and parts of the world. Secondly, the thing I mentioned about, you know, the experience of migrants. Again, I think that is a really great period of time to actually think about the teaching of partition through multidisciplinary approaches: history, literature, geography, arts, etc. You know, other music, other kinds of, you know, it's in that, as it were, period of time in young people's education that you could combine a number of different sort of approaches to this history to bring out the actual experience of this process, and to bring the history alive and to make it relevant to their contemporary you know, as it were, lives. And I know there have been some interesting kind of, you know, resources that have been put together precisely for that age group that do that really well, that talk about the actual experience of you know, movement. And then finally, just take up Sarah's point, you know, about, you know, this being really important in understanding, you know, how we come to terms with the difficult bits of history, you know, how we confront them. Again, I think, you know, the earlier we do that, as it were, in young people's education, within reason, the better they're equipped they're going to be when they do go into kind of examination, public exams, and, you know, sort of more serious secondary school level education, where they're, you know, the better they'll be able to kind of take on, or teachers will be able to take on the very challenging and difficult questions that
well, if you cover it at that sort of age, then they may have enough of an interest to take up the subject, the GCSE A level.
Exactly.
Whereas if you leave it that late and they haven't picked it, you're not actually ensuring all children are receiving the same education in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think there seems to be this idea that partition is a very sensitive subject. You know, that it's a very sensitive subject, and therefore perhaps teachers, well, it is. You know, it is a sensitive subject, but teachers feel uncomfortable or not very well equipped to maybe tackle it. So in that sense, arguably, this is a good age. You know, this is a good kind of period of education in which to start tackling it for that reason. Yeah. Okay.
Has anybody got any comments to add on the children age group we should tackle? Deborah?
I think I would just add, I suppose it's going back to Will's point about how you teach a sort of, I mean, history is very good for teaching both empathy and skepticism. I mean, it's supposed to be this most skeptical of all disciplines. But going back to what Will said about, you know, encouraging children to think about what displacement might mean, what kind of experience that is both, is resonant. I mean, it's resonant in terms of getting them to understand seismic transformations in the 20th century associated with displacement, but also contemporary migrations. And again, it's enormously useful to think about literature, to think about art, of which there is some fabulous materials that children can be introduced to. And then perhaps later on introducing students to the more, I don't know, skeptical aspects of thinking about, well, what does this mean in terms of what we call nation states, of how we think about our identities in relation to territory. I mean, the idea of the displaced person, the refugee, transforms our understanding of the relationship between identity and territory. So yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Sarah?
Yes, I agree that, you know, bringing it in earlier sort of sets things up for later. But my own sort of the feedback that I've had from teachers is that they're really quite keen on this period of Key Stage 3. And while obviously there are certain sort of expectations of what will happen during that period, actually there's more room for maneuver than maybe somebody like me appreciates. And so if teachers are being supported with the kind of material that provides both context and confidence, you know, to tackle topics that are unfamiliar, then I would have thought that Key Stage 3 would, you know, must be a good time in the school life cycle to deal with this, bring it in.
It is, yeah. So just to kind of elaborate a little bit, we have got teachers who are very interested. In fact, throughout South Asian Heritage Month, since we've had our website up and running, we have been inundated with contacts from India, from the UK, from all over, people who really, really want to be a part of this. But it's important, you know, that we are able to think about how we produce the material. So we've got primary and secondary teachers, leaders, subject leaders, RSP experts, history experts, and they are going to hopefully in the next year, in readiness to the 75th anniversary, think about producing materials for primary years 3, 4 and 5, and secondary year 8, 9. So we don't go near the GCSE side. But as Will said earlier, also, you know, we could produce the best materials in the world if the teachers themselves standing in front of that classroom are not confident about the subject, then we won't achieve what we're setting out to achieve. And therefore, planning this sort of cycle in a way that means that we do run a pilot with some schools and also make sure that there's some teacher training available, so working with teaching schools perhaps. So these are all kind of fairly early days, but that's the kind of direction in which we are going. I am now reminded that we've kind of just gone over an hour. So I think I'll just wrap up. So what we're planning on doing is running more events like this, perhaps with actual audience participation, so they can ask questions, probably on Zoom. And I'm hoping to run some with teachers and young people as well, because I think it's important that we hear from them. And in the meantime, if anybody who's watching, listening, please do follow us on Twitter. It's at Partition Group, and on Insta, which unfortunately I don't use, but apparently it's fantastic. It's at Partition Education, and also our website, which is partitioneducationgroup.wordpress.com. And you can subscribe to emails, updates and things. And there's also a wealth of information up there, which we are constantly adding to. We put out a request for blogs, and again, we have had people come forward willing to write blogs for us on partition, on impact, on personal stories, all sorts. That hopefully we will be upgrading that as well. And all that now remains for me to do is to thank the panel. Thank you very much, Deborah, Will and Sarah. Thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. And whoever's watching, listening when this goes out, thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to you joining us again soon. Thank you.